Welcome back to Foresight Dialogues, where we bring you discussions between subject matter experts. Today, we're discussing artificial intelligence, a technology moving at a pace our institutions, our regulations, and frankly, our thinking is struggling to keep up with. We'll explore what this means for policymakers in developing economies, how they should think about AI at a strategic level, and the deeper questions around power, morality, and why ideas like AI and the Antichrist, commonly known as Dajjal in Islamic culture, are increasingly being discussed in the same breath. This is a really exciting conversation. I'm actually quite pumped. I think this is going to be good. So let's get cracking. Let's start with what I think is worth doing. Imagine you are advising the Saudi government. What would you advise? How do you devise a strategy where you don't get choked off?
Yeah. So Saudi Arabia is in a advantageous position because it's so energy rich, right? So countries will always be demanding Saudi energy, oil and gas. Now, obviously, China has a monopoly on rare earths. So I think they have around about 60% of rare earth reserves, and they have a monopoly over processing as well, which I think is about 90%. And these are the critical minerals that go into GPU manufacturing GPUs. So in that scenario, Saudi has an advantage because they have oil and gas, which is what China needs in order for them to be able to manufacture these GPUs. So in that scenario, it makes sense for them to come to a beneficial agreement whereby China has access to the energy that it needs, and Saudi has access to the rare earths that it needs to manufacture the GPUs.
And could it do a deal with Russia or Ukraine, depending on who wins that conflict? Because there's quite a lot of rare earths in that part of the world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think China really has a monopoly over rare earths at the moment, because it's not just about the basic material. It's also about the ability.
No, but I'm only saying that because of you don't want to bank with one supplier.
Of course, I agree with you. So long term, it makes complete sense that you don't want to create sort of bottlenecks for yourself. So over time, it makes sense to transfer some of the processing to another country, but that obviously is going to require establishing the processes, and that's going to take time. So
thank you. What is AI? How does it work? So for our audience, there's a lot of noise around AI, a lot of terms, things misunderstood. Just explain, what is AI and what is it not?
Sure. So firstly, thank you for inviting me to your awesome podcast. I've been listening to it and it's been awesome.
Thank you.
So AI, obviously, the acronym is artificial intelligence. It's actually been around for decades. It's been around since the 40s, 50s. Many of the concepts that are applied today have essentially come from people like Alan Turing in the past, who were pioneers during World War to crack the German Enigma code. Essentially, a branch of AI was used for that. But there are multiple parts to AI. Today, we use ChatGPT and we think that's AI. Actually, it's a lot more than that. There are many different strands to it. In particular, the concept of deep neural networks, where ultimately you are providing information to the deep neural network.
Just explain that for our audience. So what is a neural network? That sounds like a brain.
You could literally compare it as a kinetic brain, right? Where essentially you are providing information to this architecture of nodes. They actually call them the generation of weights, where the information comes to the neural network. Multiple training is done, essentially by trial and error.
So how does one view AI? So I think Usman has put it nicely, but if we just maybe simplify it for people, there's about 5 or 6 different strands of research just after World War II. So you mentioned Alan Turing, sort of machine learning, deep learning, natural language processing, NLP, computer vision, robotics, and expert systems. So those are the 6 main branches. And each of them are actually developed independently. There was actually not that much cross-collaboration at the onset. So all of that, and it wasn't really called artificial intelligence necessarily. Each one was doing something slightly different. So, machine learning was used to detect patterns, for example. Deep learning is more like brain-like architecture, hence why I asked the question. So all of these 6 phenomena, if you like, were being researched. And during the 80s and 90s, they started to come together as a concept. And obviously, in the last 20 years, with the advances in networks, in data, in storage, just internet, bandwidth, all these things have made some of these leaps, quite easy to do, or relatively easy to do. So it's come together as one branch of knowledge. So AI is not one thing, basically, which I think is quite helpful to understand. What I would also say is the transformer tech. So most people don't know what GPT means. General purpose transformer. What is a transformer? It comes from a research done in 2017 by Google. There was a paper, Attention is All You Need. And it's looking essentially at, can we look at a sequence holistically rather than individually? So if we said the cat, then he said the cat sat. The cat sat on the mat. This is how traditionally you would look at, this is how AI would work, or this is how predictive algorithm would work. What the leap was, the transformer can look at the whole thing together. The cat sat on the mat, right, in the room. It will then look at each component and decide which of these components are more important than the other. So it will actually weight them. And essentially that's what the transformer tech is. So Google had this technology, and it was okay. They were reluctant to deploy it because they were worried about copyright and infringement and such things. Then OpenAI came up, were less concerned about such things, and deployed it on the internet. And so hence you had this general purpose transformer, which is looking at sequence and mainly words, and it can then predict the next word or the next sequence of words. So that's what ChatGPT is. It's basically a very smart prediction algorithm, which has a feedback loop. Every time it tries to work something out, if it gets it wrong and you correct it, that's where the learning happens.
Essentially, that's one part of AI. Another part of AI, another branch of AI is machine learning. That's been there forever, right? It's been there. People have been doing machine learning for some time. It's just recently this concept of deep neural network via ChatGPT, it's captured the attention of many people because it solves a particular outcome.
Thank you. So before I come to Shad, the central thesis of this podcast is the developing world. If you put yourselves as, in your mind, advising a government, whether it's Saudi Arabia or whether it's Malaysia, or in fact any other country that's looking to develop AI independence, maybe put that context in. So the first question, can the developing world afford to sit this out? Can they just let AI develop and take a backseat while this essentially works its way through? Either of you can answer.
Okay. The answer is, from my humble opinion, is no. I think it would be massively costly if, say that, as they say, the East or the, essentially the nations of the Middle East, right? Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, African countries as well.
Global South. Let's just say
Global South. The Global South, exactly.
Global South.
That was actually the term I was looking for. My mind went blank. The Global South.
You need an AI for that.
Yes. Absolutely cannot afford to sit it out.
Yeah.
And actually what we should be doing, or what the Global South should be doing, is looking at, if I just take a step back,
sure.
And I just commented on this recently, power is a critical element of AI.
I saw your post yesterday.
Yeah, right. And so the ability, running the models is one thing and doing inference is one thing, but if you don't have the electricity, or you don't have the energy to power the GPUs to run all of this, then you're dependent, right, on other parties. And actually, just on that point, the first point is, if you do set it out, you're going to become dependent, right, on other countries for your AI capability, which means you're not in control of your AI capability, and you do need to be in control of your AI capability, just because there are laws and governance issues within your own country that need to be addressed. But in my humble opinion, countries should think, where's the energy in our country? How do we source energy in our country?
Yeah.
So you look at Saudi, for example, huge energy supplier, right? Both obviously from a fossil fuel perspective, but also solar perspective, right? In some of our countries, solar actually is a decent.
We will come on to the stack
Okay,
in
sure.
a minute, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
because this is a really important
Sure.
point.
No.
But I guess I think what you're saying is they can't afford to sit it out.
They cannot afford to sit it out.
Yeah.
Absolutely not, because the consequence is you become dependent.
Yep.
Right, and then you're not in control of your AI destiny.
Understood. Shad, what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, so I think if I put my economist hat on, I think really the question needs to be asked is, so in terms of the tool itself, I think we can all agree it's a phenomenal tool, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that it's something that potentially could amplify human capability, that it can make human beings more, productive than we already are. But I think from an economist perspective, the question we really need to answer is, does the output warrant the resource cost? Right. So there's already an argument that is being had whether or not the AI sector is actually in a bubble right now. So meaning that, I think one of the best descriptions that I've heard of there is by a tech journalist by the name of Ed Zitron that described AI as basically like a black hole. What it's doing is sucking all of these resources and effectively it's consuming it. But there's a question mark around whether or not actually the output sort of warrants the investment.
But what's your position on that? Do you think these global South countries should invest?
So again, it needs to be on the basis of how much benefit that it brings, because you've also got to factor in here geopolitics as well. So, we're essentially witnessing deglobalization, right? So we're moving away from a globalized world to effectively a multipolar world, which basically means that countries are going to have to become more self-sufficient and independent.
Yeah.
So whatever resources they possess is going to be more.
I'm going to have to press you on this. Should they sit it out or should they not sit it out?
They should, but it's dependent on ultimately the resource cost. It's whether or not it's economical for them to do it. This is what it comes down to.
But the assessment to make that assessment, right? I think what yardstick is applied, right, is an important question. So if you're Pakistan, for example, right, from an economy perspective, there's lots of challenges, right? Yet they see from the West the benefits that the Western societies are getting from AI, for example, right? So to give a simple example, someone who's uneducated, doesn't have a whole load of means, but has an internet connection and a computer, can suddenly start to do things, right, that they couldn't do before, just through the knowledge that they can gain through, let's just say ChatGPT as an example. I know people who didn't go to university, didn't go to college, but now they're running a business purely using knowledge gained from ChatGPT. I also know people in Pakistan actually who've started to use these tools to start businesses, right, which where previously they couldn't, right? But again, the point here is that they rely on the West. They rely on Western technology. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But Pakistan, I think, as a government, maybe Bangladesh as well, they're seeing this, right? So from their perspective, they're thinking, okay, so we definitely need to do something about this. Otherwise, we're just going to be fully dependent.
So look, my two pennants on this is a general purpose technology, like electricity, like other technologies before it. And what I mean by that is general purpose technologies affect everything. That's the problem with them. You cannot localize them and say, well, we'll just use AI for this. Actually, electricity is used for everything. Energy more widely is used for everything. And increasingly, AI is being used for everything. So my view is I don't know that a developing economy can afford to sit this out. I think they would need to take some stake in it. Otherwise, they will get left behind.
So really, the point that I was trying to make. So you made the point about the United States and Pakistan looking at the United States and the benefit that technology is bringing. But it's important to acknowledge that when you look at, for example, the US economy, that there's only very few things that they specialize in, which is one of them is AI. Sure. So now, if Donald Trump has his way and he's able to reindustrialize the US, there's going to be immense resource competition now, right? Because that's the point. Yes. From an economic perspective, it's about resource allocation, right? So these are the kind of decisions that have to be made. That okay, look, if we are looking to bring back all of these industries, they're also going to need energy. They're also going to need water. So you're going to have to prioritize. Do we allocate resources to this particular endeavor, or do we allocate
that's
it
a fair
to
point.
AI?
That's a fair point.
So these are the kind of calculations that need to be made.
I mean, no, completely. I don't think you're saying don't invest. I think you're saying,
No.
okay. But just like, I think to maybe frame it simpler for our audience, I mean, there's productivity outputs, right? Because GDP, which is, it's not always a great measure of the sort of health of a economy, but it is a measure, and it shows you that, if you can increase the GDP per person by using AI, that's going to give you a massive advantage, right? Meaning the output per person, that's going to be a massive advantage. It's transformative, affects every part of life. It's essential to things like national security more and more. A lot of security is now being run by agents, and they're able to sense and see patterns faster than humans can. Plus, you remove the fear of spies and double agents and these sorts of things, because it's a bot, it's an agent, so it's not going to have any allegiance anywhere else. But I think also there's a narrative and cultural dominance aspect, which is very important as well, which we'll come to in a minute. So I think those are some of the things I would be concerned with as an economist. So if we just now move on, what I want to talk about is what do you need if you were to develop an independent AI strategy? Again, to either of you, what do you need to control? What is it that you need to think about?
Yeah. Oh, sure. So I think Usman's already kind of alluded to it by mentioning the AI stack. So obviously AI, there are various components to it. Energy is one component to it. Then you've got compute, so production of GPUs and other sort of essential hardware.
Please explain GPUs for our audience.
GPUs are essentially a souped up version of CPUs. So it's computer processors. But obviously, because AI is so resource intensive and so much more powerful, it requires far more powerful processors. So GPUs, I think they stand for graphics
graphical processor unit.
Graphics.
If you ever played PS5 games,
yes,
they run on GPUs, but now they're used for.
So GPU is a very, it's a very. No, actually, you explain it. No, you explain it.
So I'll try and be as simple as I can, but just to explain. So I'm sure many of us have played computer games. Yeah. Right. And
misspent youth, yes.
Yes,
Absolutely.
exactly right.
Absolutely.
And so many of the computer games we played were like 3-dimensional graphics, right? So do you remember we started off with 2-dimensional graphics?
I remember
Super Mario
Doom.
Bros.
I remember Doom.
Right? Doom, right, etc. Right, and then suddenly they became 3-dimensional.
Yeah.
Right? And a lot of this is about mathematics, right? So specifically linear algebra in mathematics, right, which ultimately is the mathematical models behind 3-dimensional vector space, right, and how you do transformations in that vector space. That's just, these are essentially matrix vector calculations, okay? So matrix vector calculations on CPUs are slow, but graphical processing units were specifically designed to accelerate matrix vector calculations.
Yes.
Right, so GPUs are quite dumb, actually. Right, they're not very good at doing what CPUs can do. Like a GPU cannot run an operating system.
No,
like a CPU can. Right,
yeah.
A CPU architecture is designed to crunch the operations to do with allocating resources on your computer or your laptop. Right, but a GPU is very good and very extremely fast at matrix calculations. Right, and so essentially these deep neural networks, right, that now power these large language models are also doing these matrix calculations to calculate those coefficients, those weights, right? Good. So that's where GPUs come from. And obviously we know that the biggest manufacturer of these GPUs is NVIDIA, and there's a whole bunch of other companies. But as part of the AI stack, that's a critical element.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just a complete side note. I remember the first GPU I bought was the Sound Blaster 16.
Nice.
Show my age. Yeah, show my age. Anyway, so you talk about a stack.
Yeah.
So the stack, at first you said was power.
Yeah. So at the base of all of it is power.
Right.
Without energy, none of this functions basically. So
above. So
basically, it's just to add to what Shad said, right? The power is critical, right? So you literally have to figure out: is it going to be coal powered? Is it going to be solar powered? Is it going to use your oil essentially? Are you going to build hydroelectric dams, right? More of those, right, to essentially generate the electricity. Then after that, it's the data center, right? So you need your data centers. Within the data center, there's a whole bunch of technology that sits within that.
Yep.
The GPUs, in effect, sit inside the data center.
And the cooling. And
right?
Yep.
And all of the infrastructure typically required for a data center is required. And then the models, right? So the actual, large language models, stroke machine learning models that are deployed in that data center that then, people access, right? Your community access, right? And for that, you need a whole bunch of networking capability as well.
So that the models are sitting on data, on actual data assets. Right?
Yes. So to be even more precise, imagine like a server room, right? I'm sure you've seen pictures of these server rooms with stacks of servers, right? Those servers essentially are, you could say, are Linux operating systems installed on the servers. And then within that, there are like hard disks and all that attached.
Yeah.
These models, one model might be 40 gigabytes, another one might be 500 gigabytes, right? Those models sit within those servers, are installed within those servers. But the issue is when you prompt ChatGPT, for example, okay, essentially that prompt is going through the neural network, doing the probabilistic inference and giving you the sequence of predicted texts, right? That's just you. Now imagine 100 million people doing that, right?
People,
Well, obviously now you need many more GPUs, right? Because the model itself sits in the memory, right, of the GPU, right? And what you have to be able to do is run that model across many GPUs to service the demand.
Yep.
That's why you have these big data centers, right, with like thousands of GPUs, where ultimately these models are running on those GPUs to help service the demand. So you have to be in control of your data centers, right? You have to be in control. I'm not sure if you have to necessarily have GPU manufacturing sites. Great if you did.
Well,
right?
Don't go into that yet,
Okay,
because
sure.
that's my next question. So just for the viewers, they should see on the screen at some point, if now or just a little while ago, we as a think tank have actually produced a paper on the stack, which you should see on your screen. And that essentially explains what that is. And we've actually broadly spoken about it here, but we put it down to the materials you need, the actual rare earth minerals. Above that is the semiconductors. Above that is the compute power, which is what you're talking about, data centers and so on. Above that is the data assets themselves. Above that are the models. And then there's the application layer. And just for I use this application layer is all those AIs that you hear about. Frankly, every time you go on YouTube, someone's advertising you. That's what that sits on that application layer. And all of that essentially requires energy, cooling, talent, and governance, which effectively affects the entire stack.
Yeah.
Okay. So
just to put some context on energy specific.
Can I just on this point, if our viewers want to download that, they can go on our Substack. If you haven't logged in already, please do, and download the paper, which will hopefully explain this quite well.
Yeah, sorry, just to put some context, I think it will help if we sort of illustrate the point using some numbers. So I think in terms of global data centers worldwide consume around about 450 terawatts of power on an annual basis, right? That's around about 150% more than how much the UK consumes in electricity on an annual basis. So we're talking about it's 150% more than a country of 70 million people.
But can I just ask you a question? I know I've just interrupted you, but I think this is a really important point on my mind is that stack that we just explained that was on the screen, and you can have your own version of the stack. It doesn't matter. I mean, as long as we're talking about the same things.
Yeah.
Shad, no country can own everything. You can't own that stack. That's going to be very difficult. Not even China or USA owns that stack.
Yeah.
So where do you draw the line between dependence and independence?
So I think you're right. It's because there's so many different components that go into creating a stack. It's very difficult for one country to be able to establish complete control and ownership over every single aspect of it. So you're seeing that at the moment with, for example, the US, they have energy, they have many of the other components, they have the expertise, but what they lack is GPUs, right? Because the vast majority of them are manufactured in the Far East, in China and Taiwan. So, from that perspective, you're right. You're never going to establish complete sovereignty over the entire stack, which is why it has to be designed in a way that you can still, essentially, have control and ownership of the stack, but you need to ensure that you have access to the critical natural resources and the GPUs if they're not manufactured. So, for example, from the perspective of Saudi Arabia, they don't manufacture GPUs, but they possess oil, they possess gas, so that gives them leverage over China and Taiwan, so they can engage in some sort of mutually beneficial trade.
Yeah.
So,
Usman, what do you think?
The other thing to think about is, and first you raised some great points, right? But the other thing people are thinking about right now is why do we need such type of GPUs to power AI in this way? There's now new research coming out, which is saying, wait a minute, these GPUs that do all these matrix calculations, why should they be this way? Right? Look how, actually they're quite inefficient when you
actually, my next question was going to be about DeepSeek, but so you've actually come right onto it. But let's address it now. Okay, so sure. I was going to say, doesn't DeepSeek show you that some of this construct may be intentionally created by companies like NVIDIA to create a bubble or to create a demand for its technology, and quite simply, DeepSeek's neural networks, essentially it just turns on bits and pieces of it as it needs, using a mixture of experts, that technology, which means it doesn't turn the whole thing on. It effectively, the weights and the measures for certain types of things go to certain parts of that neural network, and as it becomes an expert in that area, it only turns that bit on at that point in time, which means it needs less power, less energy, and less GPU, CPU. So that's the simplified layman explanation. I know you got the more mathematical version, but that's fine. So how do you explain that?
So, a couple of points, right? So, actually, there's an even deeper point, right? So, mixture of experts architecture, which exactly only activates certain parameters when someone prompts, right? So, for example, let's say the DeepSeek model is whatever 400 billion, 500 billion parameters. That may require 10 GPUs to run, right? On paper.
Yeah.
However, if when you prompt it, it might only activate 10 billion parameters, which means actually you can run it on 2 GPUs, for example's sake. But there's an even deeper point, right? The transformer architecture or the mixture of expert architecture it's using, is that actually the right architecture? Right? Itself, you see, and that's where there's research now.
I see.
Right? Actually, do we even need those architectures? Because there may be other architectures that don't even need this architecture of GPU. Maybe you could do a lot more with multiple CPUs. Right, that actually brings about a whole nother discussion. So the point being is what we should be doing, or what the country, for example, the East can be doing, is being at the forefront of that research. It's an intellectual exercise.
It is, yeah.
You don't need lots of resources to do it. You just need intellectual minds on it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think investing in that is important, right? Where you're right, like you won't necessarily own the entire stack. But actually, if suddenly there's another architecture that says, wait a minute, you don't need 10 data centers, right? Actually, you could do this with one data center, right? With a certain type of architecture.
What does independence mean to you? What does it actually mean?
I think independence is in owning as much of the stack as possible.
Right.
Right. This is critical because
But not even America owns all the stack.
No, I agree, but they are trying to. Like, I think when you look at the quote unquote superpowers, they are trying to own the entire stack, because of the transformational nature of the technology, right? And you're right, like not every country will be able to get to that, but it should be an objective, right? It may be that you own critical parts of the stack, right? Energy definitely is a critical part of the stack, and the point I was trying to make was like the country should be looking and saying, where is our energy? What form does our energy take, right? And now we have a real reason to tap it, right? And maybe we partner, right, to tap that. And figure out how we partner to tap these different energy sources, to create an AI between countries, right? Where those countries have a partnership, right? Because you're right, not one country will be able to do it. But for example, you have like the Organization of Islamic Countries, for example, right? That bloc could work together, right, to form a partnership to essentially own the stack between them.
I think interesting. Very, very
right?
interesting.
So, and so I think that's one area to look at. But I would definitely not discount the innovative research that's coming out. And again, like countries should be really focused on that because we're still at the beginning of these architectures. as I said, these GPUs were used for games and gaming, and nobody really changed that. Like, it's like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. That's how it's been. And so I don't think it's NVIDIA playing any games. It's like the world needed inference, right? I mean, meaning prompting and getting responses, and GPUs just happened to be there to facilitate that. And we've just carried on doing that. But now people are thinking, wait, let's take a step back. Is that the right approach?
And these are some really, really interesting thought-provoking things. So Shad, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, Usman's point about independence, I would say independence is, well, what that means to me is nobody can choke you off. So how you do that, you can do that in the most, I guess the apex, for want of a better word, Usman, of that view is you own everything. But for most countries, that won't be possible. Right?
You own everything, or you have some type of leverage.
You have some. Right. Well, no, this was my second point. So the first point is you either own everything, which is the most, that's where you want to be, right? Likelihood of that is unlikely, because every country has a certain paradigm. So, you might not live in a oil-rich place. You may have you may have hydrocarbons, or you may have rare earth minerals where you are and not have energy. So you have something of that stack. So the point is, not being choked off for me is independence. So as long as, for example, if I was in Saudi, I would be thinking about, let's take talent, for example. Saudi doesn't have enough of a population to have its own talent, but it could do a partnership, or it could do a bilateral agreement with, say, Malaysia or Pakistan, Bangladesh, parts of the African just for places where there are lots of graduates. Yeah. And it could effectively buttress that strategy in 2 or 3 countries. So it's not, you can't just choke it off in one place. Yeah. And do a bilateral deal with oil. Yeah. Securing the talent. So I'm just saying, like, that for me sounds like a more efficient way of doing it.
I agree with you. I think what it comes down to is capability. And that's the point that you're making with Saudi Arabia as an example. Obviously, there are some limitations that Saudi Arabia possesses. So in that scenario, actually having a decentralized stack makes sense. And what you're doing is you're leveraging the capabilities and the resources of other countries. Now, obviously, you have to be more selective in the relationships themselves, i.e. which countries you actually engage with and which ones you don't. So, for example, the US and China aren't going to be, sort of 2 partners that are going to closely work together. So I think Usman's idea about really, establishing, for example, an Islamic, bloc, which ultimately shares the roles and the responsibilities necessary to create the stack, which benefits all of the partners and all of the members.
So as a think tank, Forecast Economica will produce a paper taking the stack that we've already put out, and we will choose one of the economies, maybe Saudi or Malaysia or even Pakistan, and provide a policy paper on what we recommend they do to make sure they stay independent. So watch out for that, and we may even do a podcast on this once it's done, and maybe Usman, you can join that one as well. So I just want to finish with one question, which is, where does this leave Europe? Is Europe independent?
That's a great question. Right now, we're seeing geopolitically, quote unquote, conflict between Europe and the US. Where the US president has been very vocal about the lack of European engagement in the Persian Gulf. And actually, I've been traveling Europe quite a bit. We're talking to some very influential entities in Europe. And right now, Europe is recognizing its dependence on US technology, actually, specifically cloud computing, and also AI. And there is a massive movement towards European sovereignty with respect to AI and even cloud compute.
But would you say right now they have independence?
It's hard to say. I don't think so. Yeah. I think there's a huge dependency on the US at the moment. But there is a desire to now become independent. But they have similar problems. What's interesting, for example, let's just take the UK. Last year, I was actually part of this. Last year, the US came. Was it earlier this year? Last year, the US came. As you remember, President Trump came with a cohort of AI businesses to the UK and discussed, establishing AI investments in the UK. That's all on pause now.
Right.
So it's all on pause, right? Due to various internal pressures, and so you're seeing the desire to achieve independence, but getting there isn't straightforward.
Quite another matter. Shad?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think of all of the major blocs, I think Europe is in the most vulnerable position. Why?
Really?
Because no, absolutely. Because I think one, they
Even
lack,
more than the global south.
because they lack so many of the key components, right? So we're talking about there's the natural resources that are required. Europe isn't energy rich as an example. It doesn't possess rare earth minerals. So from a basic material perspective, they're lacking. Then do they possess the expertise to manufacture, GPUs and other, essential hardware? Because at the moment, it's the Far East that has a comparative advantage over that. So where do they actually have an advantage at the moment?
I mean, they are obviously, there are quite a few European companies now producing their own models.
Yes.
I mean, Mistral, for example, is a company that is producing very good large language models. So there is expertise on that front.
Yeah.
But they do have nuclear power, right? So from a power perspective, I think you might end up seeing more, a creation of nuclear power plants.
They have nuclear power plants, but they don't have uranium.
Sure.
This is the problem, right? So that's the point. So what you're talking about, the foundational models are slightly higher up on the AI stack. That's the point. You've got layers below it, which is where Europe is fundamentally lacking at the moment. So these are the things they're going to have to address if they want to become a major player.
That's a very controversial point to end this section on, but I don't think I can really disagree. So look, thank you guys for a really enlightening conversation. So I think if I just summarize, AI is not a product category. It's a layered infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's becoming foundational to how economies produce, how states govern, and how power is exercised. This is general purpose technology, so you can't afford to really sit it out. In the same class as electricity or the internet, it will shape productivity, financial systems, information flows, and social organization. I think we're concluding that full self-sufficiency across every layer is unrealistic for most countries, if not all of them, at least in the near term. Even the most advanced economies rely on global supply chains, for instance. But there is a difference between participation and dependence. A country is dependent when it cannot operate critical systems without external permission. That's the line I think that matters. So the objective is not abstract ownership of everything necessarily. The objective is more precise. A state must ensure that no single country or entity or supplier can choke off its AI capability.